The Iranian constitutional order is very different from the others that we've looked at to date, because you've got this mix of theocratic dominance in these various democratic or semi-democratic institutions. So we'll start with the judiciary. The courts function here based on Sharia law, except for two things. One, the state has the final say with respect to death sentences through its highest court of appeal. And two, the state has introduced long prison terms as a possible substitute for death, where Sharia law might otherwise prescribe death. In addition to the basic courts for criminal and civil cases in Iran, you also have two special courts. The Special Clerical Court, which is a court which is exclusively one that deals with crimes done by clerics. And then you've got the Islamic Revolutionary Courts that deal with crimes against national security, things like narcotics smuggling, any acts that are said to undermine the Islamic Republic, so the foreign agents who might have crossed the border. So a few years ago, of course, well, it's more and more years ago, so maybe not of course, we had a few American backpackers who strayed across the border for whatever reason, and they were arrested, and this is the court that they wound up in, the Islamic Revolutionary Court. And they were ultimately all released over some period of time. The head of the judiciary is sort of like a justice minister sort, and this is a cleric who's nominated by the supreme leader for a 5-year term. This is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the Chief Justice is really the head of the judiciary more broadly. So he oversees the Supreme Court, which is the highest court of appeal, but he also manages the judicial institutions, including hiring judges and firing judges, etc. So this is sort of an interesting mix, being both the Chief Justice and in charge of the entire court system. So again, what's important to note here is that he's a cleric nominated by the Supreme Leader, who we'll talk about in just a second, for a 5-year term. So the Supreme Leader, through one of his delegates, essentially controls the judiciary. So let's move on to the executive. The Supreme Leader, which is just as supreme as it sounds in a lot of ways, is an individual who must be a cleric, who is put in charge of the political and spiritual life of the state. Once you become Supreme Leader, you're a Supreme Leader for a lifetime appointment. You're appointed through the Assembly of Experts, which is an 86-member body. The Assembly of Experts can remove the Supreme Leader for incompetence, although it hasn't done so. Oh, wait, maybe it did actually. No, I don't think it's done this at all. The Assembly of Experts is directly elected. And I'm going to actually make sure that they haven't done this, and I'll put an addendum on if they haven't, because I know there was discontent with one of the Ayatollahs, but I believe he was not removed, but I will check. So the Assembly of Experts is actually directly elected by the population. But the government, the ruling government, gets to decide who can actually run for the Assembly of Experts. So it is vetted. And once you're on there for an 8-year term. So some of their chief powers are, of course, some of the Supreme Leader's chief powers are that the Supreme Leader can decide who is fit to run for president. In other words, anyone who's on the presidential ballot, which is a relatively democratic process, although we've seen shortcomings in terms of how we define free and fair and how they define free and fair in the last couple of elections. But the key point is that anyone who's on the presidential ballot has been approved by the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader is also the Commander-in-Chief. The Supreme Leader supervises policy more generally and can call for a referendum at any point. The Supreme Leader is in charge of the judiciary through his intermediary, the Chief Justice. He's also in charge of radio and TV by appointing the head of radio and TV. And so, again, recall the importance in India of this form of communication. This is a great way to send out your message because this is where most people are going to get their information. So Ayatollah Khomeini dies in 1988, and he's replaced in 1989 by Ali Khomeini, who is the current Ayatollah. The president, who exists alongside the Supreme Leader, is sort of like a prime minister in some ways. So the president's the head of government. The prime minister position did exist actually until the 1989 Constitution, and so now the president takes over in that vein. Usually the president's a cleric, because of course remember any presidential candidate is vetted by the supreme leader, and so usually this will be a cleric. The president is responsible for the state's budget. The president usually is responsible for initiating legislation, for creating his own cabinet. He also runs foreign policy, which is why you see Ahmadinejad coming out and sort of representing Iran. Not that he's the source of power in Iran, but he does run foreign policy in terms of treaties, diplomacy, and all that. But also keep in mind that he doesn't run the military. He's not the commander-in-chief of the military, so he's very constrained from that perspective on where his foreign policy can go. So I want you to think for a second of other places where there might be a power struggle in circumstances like this. So clearly in Russia, this could happen, and in fact, Medvedev did challenge Putin several times, and then Putin, I suppose it's rude to say put him in his place. Geez, but I guess it's accurate. That's sad. And then there was France, where you have periods of cohabitation when the prime minister, again, does have teeth and can challenge the president. So why don't we see a power struggle here in the case of Iran then? Think about it. If we've got the same sort of potential dilemma that we've seen in semi-presidential systems, why wouldn't you have this? Well, here you don't have this because the supreme leader has the trump card. The supreme leader has enormous political capital. Again, he determines who's going to be eligible even to be the next president. So it's risky to oppose the supreme leader for that reason as well as others. So that's the executive, and that's key to understanding how Iran functions today. In terms of the legislature, you're talking about a unicameral legislature. We haven't had many of those. That's probably the first one, actually, we've talked about, with the Majlis. It's a 290-member body. Each person comes to power for 4 years. They are directly elected. And what they do is they initiate and pass legislation. Quite often they're passing legislation that's initiated at the cabinet level. They also oversee the budget, and they have to approve the cabinet. They can remove the cabinet through a vote of no confidence, but they cannot remove the president. So unlike a standard parliamentary system where the prime minister can be removed, in Iran you don't have a prime minister, you've got a president who cannot be removed. This is the candidates for the Majlis come to power through a majority SMD system. So just for reminders, if no one gets 50% of the vote, then there's a runoff of the top two candidates in a second round for the Majlis seats. Now, so this is a unicameral legislature, but there are also two other important institutions that you need to be familiar with that deal with legislation. The first one is called the Council of Guardians, down here. The Council of Guardians is composed of 12 individuals. 6 of them are lawyers who are appointed through the Chief Justice with Majlis approval, and 6 of them are clerics who are appointed by the Supreme Leader. The role of the Council of Guardians is to review all legislation so that it's in line, to be sure that it's in line with the Islamic regime. They also oversee national elections, and they vet candidates that they don't like, who want to go off and run for seats in the Majlis. So this is very, very important. So the Majlis, what this does is it severely hampers the Majlis. The legislature can be run by reformers, as it has been, but those reformers then come up against the Council of Guardians that are going to review the legislation. And again, look at who's a member of the Council of Guardians. 6 of them are directly nominated or appointed by the Supreme Leader, and 6 of them, the other 6, are appointed by his delegate, the Chief Justice. Okay, so and the Majlis does have to approve them, but right then we're talking about the cards really being stacked against any reformist Majlis. And if that's not enough, then finally you've got the Expediency Council down here. And the Expediency Council is composed of individuals exclusively appointed by the Supreme Leader, and their whole function is to mediate in the case that the Council of Guardians, and the Majlis don't agree. So they have the final say. So what this means is that if, for some reason, the Council of Guardians, let me step back. You can expect that the Council of Guardians isn't going to want many of the reformist measures that reformist Majlis, if you're so lucky as to have one, might demand. And so what this does is it goes on to the Expediency Council, and the Expediency Council, who is a pocket council, essentially the supreme leader, is going to say, sorry, Majlis, we're sticking with what we've got. So it should be clear that this is very different from the other legislative systems that we've talked about. But it also is in some ways similar. You've got a major role for the executive. The supreme leaders, people have this final say. We've talked about other systems where the executive has a significant role in the outcomes here. And in different ways, of course. Okay, so you could think, for example, about the British experience, about the French experience. So let's talk about the parties. Inside Iran, there are about 220 plus registered political parties and organizations. There are around 65 or so opposition parties representing various ideological positions in exile outside of Iran. Sorry, you can't see me yawning, but I'm yawning. But it doesn't mean you should yawn, because this is good stuff. It's because it's actually a rainy day. Sorry, it is raining though. So we've got reformists who in 2011 had about 75 out of 290 seats. But they did do very well in the 1990s. They're referred to as the Second Khordad movement, those who supported reformists on the day of President Khatami's landslide victory. And so President Khatami was a reformist who did very well in the 1997 election. And so the Second Khordad movement are these who support the reformists then. It's the Second Khordad movement, these reformists are dominated by about 20 political parties. They're the brainchild of Iranian intellectuals. They're largely composed of Islamic leftists who were excluded from office before the first Khomeini's death in 1989. This also includes moderate religious right-wing parties. So even when we're talking about reformists, keep in mind we're not talking about overthrowing the Islamic Republic of Iran. On the other hand, you've got conservatives who in 2011 gained 182 out of the 290 seats. And these are extremist and ultra-religious right-wing parties. Now, historically, economics have been a big factor in Iranian politics, really since the 1980s. So just to be sure that this is clear, Iranian politics isn't about necessarily whether it should be an Islamic state or not. It's about the much more mundane and day-to-day issues of economics. And there's long been a fight between pro-market forces and statists, especially after 1987. At that point, there was a realization, because of the stagnating economy, and remember, this is a war-era economy, that you needed economic reform. And finally, in 1992, you had a free market faction which wins in the parliamentary elections, in the Majlis elections, and then it supports Khatami's candidacy in 1997, and Khatami comes out and he wins the 1997 elections. So we're talking about a reformist, but really largely from an economic standpoint, and perhaps from a social standpoint, but we're not talking about a political regime change. So it's not about the role of religion in society so much, because all these actors are operating within the constraints that are established by the supreme leader. If Khatami was challenging religious rule in the country, then he never would have been allowed on the presidential ballot in the first place. So in the late 1990s, political debate becomes more diverse, but free marketeers and statists both oppose a greater amount of democratic participation, and they both really oppose limits to religious rule. What they want are exclusively limited pragmatic reforms. At first, right? And then they go further than they intended to. And this is interesting. Khatami begins to call for democratic change, a reduction in religious authority. And so by 1999, students are out there protesting, and you've got violent protests. And the reformists create this new party, the Second Khordad Front, to contest the 2000 Majlis elections. Well, here you would expect the council, the Council of Guardians, to step in, because again, the Council of Guardians is responsible for vetting who can go off for the Majlis elections. But the Council of Guardians didn't disqualify these people, and they didn't disqualify these people for fear of protests. So a very important lesson here. Even non-democratic regimes are subject to broad public pressure. The question is when you're going to have that broad public pressure given the repressive apparatus. When do the gains or the benefits of engaging in contentious political action outweigh the potential costs? Once you have that, you can have a turnaround by non-democratic regimes, especially when we're talking about competitive authoritarian regimes. And Iran's an interesting case. Yes, it's a theocracy, but it's also, from a non-democratic perspective, it's a competitive authoritarian regime. So the council doesn't disqualify these candidates, and they won big. They win 189 out of 290 seats. And then Khatami is up for re-election again in 2001, and again he's re-elected. But remember, you don't have a lot of movement, and the reason you don't have a lot of movement is that the reformers just control these weak institutions. The conservatives are on the council, they're on the expediency council, they're on some of these other institutions, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, and of course, the Supreme Leader. And so ultimately they face significant repression. And by 2004, the council steps up and they ban large numbers of reformists. The opposition boycotts those elections. Voter turnout plummets. So back in the 1990s, you had around 70% voter turnout. 2004, you had around 50%. And what happens? Well, the conservatives win back power. And then the same thing happens in the 2005 presidential elections when the Tehran mayor, Ahmadinejad, who's a populist, sort of a people's man, he also gains power, okay, a conservative. And so here you see, in a nutshell, the potential influence of the public. And in some ways, the Iranian experience should remind you of the reform movements that we've seen in the USSR and or China. And actually, I might ask you, which is it more similar to? So this is a discussion question I'm likely to put up. So I want you to think about this. And you could think about lots of ways in which there are parallels. So we need to talk about a couple other important institutions. I don't have a slide for this. I really should. But write down right here, the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij. The Revolutionary Guard are a paramilitary that answer to the Supreme Leader only. The Revolutionary Guard actually have their own ministry now, and plus there are military branches. The top leaders, some of the top leaders in the state and the government are actually from the Revolutionary Guard, and they're very conservative and very anti-reform. And some say that the Revolutionary Guard has become increasingly in charge of the state, and so you've got a military-influenced regime in Iran. People were saying that in the late 2000s. Late 2000s. So, you know, circa 2007, 8, 9, during that period. And the new elections that are upcoming will sort of shed light on that. And I will update this after the next presidential elections. So there will be sort of an addendum, assuming those have already happened. The other term that I told you to be familiar with is the Basij, and we talked a little bit about those when we talked about political violence. This is a volunteer militia. It started off as a volunteer militia that was called up to fight on the front lines during the Iraq War. They were poorly trained, they were poorly equipped, but they were and they remain numerically strong. There are about 1 million of them. And they're now involved with the public morals police force, as well as various civil projects. And they also are very conservative, obviously, hence the public morals police force, and they've had a significant influence on the state. For example, a former Basij leader in 2005 became head of the national police. So they've got a significant role in running the state. So all these institutions, I want you to think about how all these institutions come together to create obstacles for any sort of reformist movement. Despite this, you have had reformist movements, and we can talk about we'll talk about civil society now. Civil society surfaced historically during periods of state weakness. Go back to 1906. Go back to 1979. And so these civil societies arose, and then in each case, they were crushed. Under Khatami, you had more freedom. You had new organizations, especially the media. But again, this was short-lived. By 1999, after you had student protests, you had the start of a crackdown. And this continues, although I'm sorry, I meant by 2009. By 2009, when you had these major student protests. So you actually did have student protests in 97 and again in 2002, 2001. But the last series of protests began in 2009 with the presidential elections when Ahmadinejad won a second term. The internet makes it a lot harder to crack down on this. And in fact, we saw lots of twittering during the last elections. You've probably, hopefully you saw some news articles about this. Twittering sort of become the hot button issue with respect to social movements, Facebook as well. So this is a way for people to gather information very quickly and to mobilize. But again, there's been a crackdown. So what happened in the last elections, since we're on that, are those 2009 elections were falsified. They announced that Ahmadinejad had won 62% of the vote with only 2/3 counted, and the reformist candidate, Mr. Musawi, promised that he was going to contest this, and students took to the streets. And so they organized, again, thanks to texting and Twitter. Yeah, actually, if you look in this picture, you'll note that, there we go, that there's actually a cell phone in this guy's hand. And so this is sort of a quintessential kind of symbolic picture. What they did is they ended up cracking down, arresting about 200 people, many of them, so the ringleaders, many of them were put on trial. And so this amounts to intimidation of the reformists. And gradually, this died down. Occasionally you still hear about protesters, but more often it's about trials than actually new protests. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as the new presidential elections come about. So again, if you think about what sort of regime this is, we're talking about a competitive authoritarian regime, an illiberal democracy in a lot of ways. I guess I might as well mention the Iranian workers in terms of a movement. They do have the right to form labor unions, but in actuality, there's no union system in the country, so they're not a particularly strong force. So just to single them out as a sort of usual suspect. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the political economy. Oil and gas account for somewhere upwards of 70% of government revenue. Iran is the fourth largest oil producer, but interestingly, it's going to need more than it can actually produce within the next 5 or 10 years. It's argued that it's about the second largest, it has probably the second largest reserves of natural gas. So it's largely a resource-based economy. Historically, in the 20th century, it followed a mercantilist platform. We talked about the export-oriented industrialization a little bit. What this did is it changed the face of the country dramatically. Because as you have more and more industrialization, you have more and more urbanization. So major urbanization by the 1970s. And as I mentioned from the get-go, this also means that you've got significant dislocation. So when people are removed from their agrarian or their semi-nomadic ties, and these social networks begin to crumble. Now, in this case, around 60 to 70% of the economy has actually been controlled by the state. And this is what we mean when we were talking about statists versus free marketeers. The free marketeers coming to power in the 1990s and trying to loosen the grip. So it's interesting if you compare this to China. China is a quote-unquote communist country, but only about 20% of the economy is controlled by the state. Here, you're talking about somewhere around 2/3. Citizens receive price controls. They receive subsidies, especially on food and energy. Oil is dirt cheap there. Gas is dirt cheap. The economy has generally been pretty bad since the Iranian Revolution. You had war, and then you've had a dependence on an international commodity. And of course, as of late, you've got sanctions on that commodity. Commodities are never good to rely to depend on because, of course, they fluctuate. And so, I sound like a grandfather now. Back in 1998, when I drove across country with my girlfriend, who's now my wife of 80 years, the gas prices were like 98 cents a gallon. And of course, of late, they've been $3, $4 a gallon. And this is great for Iran. Well, it was great for Iran until the last round of sanctions. Now it's not so good for Iran because they can't sell their oil very effectively. 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. We've got unemployment and actually that's probably increased under the sanctions over the last year. and more than 20% unemployment. Okay, these are the key points. And one other point that I wanted to bring up is the resource trap. The resource trap refers to the ease with which a natural resource can be tapped into and depended on and feed corruption. And oil drove easy corruption before 1979. It also resulted in the growth of inequality and increased resentment to the regime and, of course, its Western backers, hence the revolution. Hence these coups that we supported in the face of populist pressures. Supposedly, Iran is now using oil money to help the people. So there are these parastatal foundations known as bonyads that are set up that control somewhere around 20% of the economy and are supposedly used to help disadvantaged people. The problem with parastatals is that they are they're state-owned, state-run institutions essentially. So they often resist giving up their companies, even those companies that are doing badly, because they're seen as a source of power and a source of influence, and they receive these benefits from the state, and they don't want to see these benefits go, and so they become a strong lobby in and of themselves. So go back to the to the 1990s and the early 2000s when you had free marketeers, reformists who took power. They were hindered perhaps by the institutional configuration, as I've discussed, but they've also been hindered by the fact that you've got these entrenched interests. And so I'm going to stop there. I know this was a long set of slides, and so hopefully you're still awake enough to turn this off. 26 minutes. Oops, sorry. That's that, and over.